This week, the House passed a resolution that was billed as expressing solidarity with the Syrian people in the aftermath of the devastating earthquake. But what it really was a measure to reaffirm the Caesar Act. And Max, you've covered this extensively at the Grayzone. These are these draconian sanctions that the U.S. passed that basically are explicitly designed to prevent Syria's reconstruction after a decade-long dirty war that the U.S. played a major part in fueling. And the Caesar Act not only targets, Syrian firms and the Syrian government to prevent them from rebuilding, but it targets basically anybody in the world, any company, any government that even thinks about doing business with the aim of helping to rebuild Syria. And this was passed overwhelmingly on a voice vote back when it passed, and Trump put it into law. And there's a story behind it, Max, that you've told that I think you should catch us up on, because the way it came to being is, of course, like everything to do with the Syrian dirty war, full of deception. But this week, a measure in Congress just to reaffirm the Caesar Act and reaffirm the importance of U.S. sanctions on Syria, even as Syria is trying to rebuild from this earthquake. The only people to vote against it were in the House were Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, both Republicans. So every single member of the squad, Ro Khanna, all these other Democrats, all voted to support sanctioning Syria after a devastating earthquake.
So all the members of the squad voted yay.
Yeah.
And any insight into why Marjorie Taylor Greene would vote against
it? I don't know.
I mean, she's been pretty good on Ukraine.
She's been great on Ukraine. She's just, I mean, obviously she has views on other issues that I think are unhinged, like on China and any number of domestic issues. But when it comes to the issues of Ukraine and now the issue of Syria sanctions, she's in the right. And that has to be acknowledged. And that makes the progressives who are lining up with neocons to support sanctions on earthquake-torn Syria or support funding the Ukraine proxy war, that makes them all the more derelict that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene has a more sensible position than they do.
And Thomas Massie, we've interviewed him at the Grayzone on Ukraine. He's been a consistent opponent of that proxy war. He's a Ron Paul style libertarian. And, I know from sources that his staff who are actually attempting to do some lobbying after the February 19th anti-war rally in Washington, that members of his staff actually attended the rally. So, I don't agree with him on a lot of domestic issues, but I get sassy with Massie when it comes to ending these sanctions that are genocidal, that have basically caused a famine inside Syria, that have plunged a country that was once doing fairly well, even better than Jordan in some respects, in that, there's 24-hour electricity in rural areas, into a state of poverty. And here are Syrian children protesting the sanctions.
Syria before the dirty war had among the highest levels of healthcare in the region, among the highest levels of food self-sufficiency, and among the highest levels of education. And all that was wiped out by the dirty war, all of it. And now, as it tries to rebuild, you have a policy of trying to prevent that with sanctions. And all these Democrats are on board with that. And also, meanwhile, where are they on the occupation of Syria? The U.S. occupying 1/3 of Syria with the explicit goal of stealing its oil and wheat. And another Republican, Matt Gaetz, just recently introduced a measure to end that occupation. And I'll be curious to see how Democrats vote on that. Democrats like Jamal Bowman have put forward a measure to hold, which calls for holding a vote on whether to authorize the U.S. military occupation of Syria, which is fine. It's better than nothing. But Gaetz is going further. He's saying, no, let's hold a vote on ending the occupation of Syria right now. And we'll see what happens. That vote should be happening pretty soon.
Well, I think we'll see the same result. And as long as a Democrat is in the White House and behind this policy, the squad will fall in line. And we've also seen Ro Khanna actually teeing up the new Cold War with China, or the new straight up war with China.
Yeah.
Declaring China as the #1 competitor of the U.S. So it feels a little bit hopeless here. The Syrian opposition was also in town in Washington, the quote unquote opposition, who are basically just the Syrian hand puppets of the national security state to lobby against ending sanctions to Syria. I mean, the ultimate sellouts. It's like the black people who went and fought for the Confederacy in the Deep South, like the dozens of them.
These members of the so-called Syrian opposition must not have any family in Syria, because sanctions affect everybody, and they're making life even more miserable for millions of Syrians. So how can you support a medieval siege of your country that you claim to care about, no matter what you feel about its government? How can you support a siege of its people, which is what sanctions target explicitly? It's just incredible.
Well, I mean, here's someone saying it, Aaron, who happens to be in an interview with Matt Duss, now at the Carnegie Endowment, former Bernie Sanders top foreign policy advisor, someone who is portrayed as taking on the blob on the cover of The Nation. And this is Agatha Desmarais, a self-described global thought leader who's in the World Economic Forum Expert Network, explaining what sanctions really are about in some pretty ghastly but candid terms. Sorry, I don't have the volume.
Hardship on the those sanctions that tend to work best are the ones that impose hardship on the population of targeted countries, exactly for the reason that we discussed a few minutes ago, because we want the population of targeted countries to tell their governments that they want them to change course. And so one tool to do that is to fuel inflation in targeted countries by essentially making access to foreign exchange reserves more difficult, for instance. So we need to recognize that this is a policy dilemma. On the one hand, we don't want people in sanctioned countries to suffer, but on the other hand, the most effective way for the US to gain concessions from targeted countries. So very, very difficult policy dilemma, I would say.
Oh, yes. So difficult.
Very
wow.
Difficult. On the one hand, we don't want to commit genocide. On the other hand, we want to commit genocide. And that's what the U.S. needs to do. The U.S. needs to fuel inflation in other countries and make commodities unavailable to the population. And Matt Duss is nodding along. He does, to be fair, although he supported all these policies in practice, as far as I know, to be fair, he said that these policies can be considered economic terrorism and they are described as evil. And he does kind of push back on her.
Okay. I missed that. Well, then where is he on the sanctions on Syria or in Venezuela? I've never seen him oppose them. Let's see him come out and actually call out the actual policies of imposing economic terror on civilians from Syria to Venezuela. I've never seen him do that. And what a commentary on the state of the progressive movement inside the U.S., that someone like that can be considered progressive. He's the former foreign policy to Bernie Sanders. And I mean, that's great that he can acknowledge that sanctions have a toll, but unless he's willing to take any action on it, like actually oppose the policies of imposing that economic harm, it doesn't really account for much. But yet this is someone who's considered to be a progressive, who's in complete lockstep on the Ukraine proxy war and nods along as someone talks about a dilemma of recognizing that we are deliberately harming civilian populations. But on the other hand, that achieves our goal of destabilizing their government. So seeing that as somehow a dilemma, you only can see that as a dilemma if you're an unhinged sadist who grants themselves the right to destroy other countries. And that's what the U.S. foreign policy community is. And Matt Duss is a part of that.
You know, I actually respect the unhinged sadists who go into these countries and murder people with their bare hands, because it takes a little bit more guile. Yeah. And you're actually taking responsibility for the evil that you commit. But these people, they are literally Little Eichmanns. Yep. They're the definition of Little Eichmanns, because what was Adolf Eichmann? He was the administrative criminal who embodied the banality of evil, Hannah Arendt's definition or term. What did he do? I mean, there's some debate over whether he actually visited some concentration camps, but he basically sat in an office with a suit on and signed away hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. That made him a mass murderer, and that's what he was put on trial for. He wasn't put on trial for actually strangling people or shooting them. And that's what this woman, Agatha Desmarais from the World Economic Forum Expert Network, is as well.
Agatha in that clip is talking about how, it serves our goals to impose hardship on civilian populations. So she's willing to countenance imposing hardship on entire populations. She can't even tolerate criticism on Twitter. because people who were tagging her with criticism for that comment, she was untagging herself. So she's willing on behalf of entire countries to say that we have the right to impose hardship on your civilians. She can't even take some feedback on Twitter.
Right. Nor can Matt Duss. I mean, he's blocked us all.
I'm sure people who are going without food and medicine in Syria, like, you know, in Syria, like, which also used to be very self-sufficient when it comes to pharmaceutical drugs. They produced them in their own country before the Dirty War. The Dirty War wiped all that out. And now they don't have the basic medications that they need to treat people. They don't have the basic equipment. I'm sure they would love it if all they got from the US was some angry comments on Twitter. You know, if Agatha and all these other people who want to destroy the country were just tweeting at them, they would love that rather than destroying their economy and preventing them from rebuilding.